The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. This is Ray Fioli from Inception Technologies. We're going to give it just another minute or so before we kick things off, so be patient and we will start the webinar momentarily. Thank you. Okay, I think we'll get going. I know we're recording the session, so we'll be able to forward this to anybody who joins a little late. Good morning, my name is Ray Fioli again from Inception Technologies. Most of you know us from the ECM workflow workspace. We've been a long-standing provider of document management and workflow solutions. We have partnered with Datto in the last couple of years to offer their business continuity solutions, and it's something that a lot of our customers aren't aware of, and we're trying to help bring this to your attention. One of the areas that we personally found intriguing was this SaaS data protection solution that Datto offers. And I won't get into it too much, but needless to say, it flies under the radar in many organizations. And so we want to help educate our customers and make them aware of a possible area of risk for them. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael and let him go through his solution and the service that they offer.
Awesome. Thank you, Ray. So my name is Mike DePalma. I'm the Senior Channel Development Manager for North America here at Datto. So as Ray mentioned, we're mostly a backup disaster recovery company based out of Norwalk, Connecticut. So we're actually down about 40 miles east of Manhattan. We have been around for about 14 years, mostly focusing on on-premise server-based backup. And that, to be honest, up until a couple of years ago, that's where the vast majority of business data lived. And when we look at attacks and things like that, the vast majority of attacks still occur on on-premise Windows-based servers. That doesn't mean that SaaS data is immune to these attacks. It's just that the criminals know that the vast majority of data still lives there. As data tends to migrate and lives in a lot of different places, now we're seeing those criminals follow that. And we saw over the last 10 months the migrations really start to accelerate in the IT space. Kind of the cliche term is, accelerated 10 years in the last 10 months. And that's really been true. And the adoption rate of things like Microsoft 365 and G Suite really have skyrocketed. And, if you look at some of these, the industry data behind that, I mean, this is where the future is really headed. And thank goodness we live in this world. I mean, that's really what has allowed the economy to stay up and running, the ability to collaborate remotely and communicate remotely and have meetings. I'm sure everybody listening in spends their day staring at a screen. Nobody picks up the phone anymore. It's always let's set up a Zoom meeting, let's set up a Teams meeting. And even when we get back into whatever that normalcy is that hopefully we're seeing coming soon, I think this is really where we're here to stay. Businesses have made investments into this. Folks have gotten used to collaborating in this fashion. And so we're only going to see these tend to rise. Now, when it comes to that data that lives there, I think it's important to understand that wherever critical business data lives, it's imperative that data is protected. I think one of the first things you need to do as a business is to take a step back and evaluate where does my data live? Let's take a full inventory. Does it still live on premise somewhere? Do we have remote workstations that have critical data on it? Well, that needs to be backed up. And then where does other critical data live? Does it live in things like SharePoint or some of the other collaboration tools? That's very important. And when we look at some of the data behind whether this data is being backed up, less than a quarter of folks that are using these SaaS applications are backing up their data via a third party. With Microsoft, there is a native Microsoft offering within that, but we did a recent Datto Tech Day where it was just focused on SaaS applications and SaaS protection. And we actually were fortunate enough to have somebody come on and join a panel from Microsoft's cloud infrastructure team, and they were very open about their desire to have folks back up that data in a third party. And the simple question was, well, why don't you just create your own, right? I mean, you're Microsoft. And yes, they do have layers of protection, the junk box and things like that. It's like anything else. If you have an old-fashioned server and your data is being backed up on the C drive, do you want to just replicate that to another drive, or do you want it to go off to a third-party site? Most folks within the space will encourage you to back that data up via a third party. And the reasons are pretty simple. About 7 in 10 of these organizations have suffered or will suffer business disruption due to this unrecoverable data loss within these SaaS applications. Folks might have been impacted recently by some of the outages within Azure, or even with some of the outages we've seen for Microsoft 365. And so while, yes, the integrity of these data centers are very, very strong, there's a lot of other ways that data can be lost. And, we come down to the cyber resiliency conversation, which starts with people and then processes and then technology. And people are your greatest risk. And the vast majority of these data losses occur because maybe it was just a inadvertent deletion that didn't get caught, and then it has now gone 30 days and got expunged from the junk mailbox. Maybe it was a malicious person internally. We did see that. We normally saw those malicious actors at the enterprise level, but I did a panel discussion towards the back end of 2020 with a gentleman who was an attorney in Pennsylvania focusing on cybersecurity, and they did see an uptick in this. And the theory behind it was, there were a lot of layoffs and disgruntled folks, and so there were some folks doing that. But a lot of times also the attackers are relying upon not them having brute force getting into these systems, but instead somebody opening the door and letting that criminal into the system. And when we look at the stats behind data recovery, they're pretty staggering, regardless of where that data lives. It's very hard to pinpoint an exact dollar value on what an hour of downtime can cost a particular business, because it varies so much based on size or industry that you're in or region. But the numbers are staggering. We have a ransomware study that came out back end of last year, and it showed that the average cost of a ransomware attack to a small business just in North America, and these are focused just on small businesses, was over $300,000. These are some actually pretty conservative numbers here. And one of the discussions I had with a gentleman from the Department of Homeland Security, he was going through some of the stats that they have. Now, any of the governmental agencies, they're very strict about sharing their slides or letting you even take pictures of their slides, which is kind of counterintuitive because they're giving public conversations about it. You could take as many notes as you want. But their data behind the average length of a ransomware attack is 16.2 days. And again, the vast majority of folks think that ransomware is, again, only occurring on those Windows-based on-premise servers, but we're seeing ransomware attacks wherever that data lives. Microsoft 365 is susceptible to these attacks. And when we see just this rise, the criminals are opportunistic. They are going to follow that data wherever it lives. And you can go back to that, opportunistic traits of these folks when you look at the pandemic itself. Early on, right when the pandemic really started to get some teeth into it, we saw immediately emails coming out from the CDC, from the World Health Organization. They looked and felt exactly like any email you would have gotten from those organizations. And they would have hyperlinks. Click here to find out cases in your area. Click here if you have any of these symptoms. And again, what was behind these attacks was not an email coming from the CDC. It was a malicious email disguised as an email from one of these organizations, and it would drive you to a site that would infect your network with malware. We're seeing that on those SaaS applications as well. And within that ransomware report that I mentioned, we talked to the managed services community, so folks like Ray all around the world, but this one focused just on North America within these stats. 6 in 10 said that remote work due to the COVID-19 pandemic resulted in an increase in ransomware attacks. And the stats from third parties, they vary, but they all show the trend moving upward. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that folks, their guard tends to be let down when you're working in places where you're not normally used to working, whether you're in your kitchen or you're in a home office or things like that, or you're just not surrounded by your coworkers. An email comes in that looks a little suspicious that normally you might poke your head up over the cubicle and say, hey, did you get this email? You don't have the ability to do that when everybody's working remote. Even if you're in the office, but half the staff is not, there's just that natural tendency to let your guard down. And again, whether your office is planning on going back to the office or maybe you are fully back in the office, we now live in this world where we don't pick up the phone and call if we get an email from our boss saying, hey, go buy a couple $500 gift cards. I need them ASAP for a client. You could use the corporate card. We saw an uptick in those type of frauds. That's just these criminals understand that. And so they're going to continue to do that. And as things change, whatever happens in 2021 and beyond, they're going to pivot and exploit whatever kind of chaos is going on with that. And you could Google all this stuff. I mean, I have my Google Alert set up to run, searches for all of these things. And every day you'll find stats and stories about companies using Microsoft 365 being hit with these attacks. More than half of these business email users have become victims of phishing malware. And we know that. And there's a lot of great tools that block these attacks from getting in, but it's almost impossible to protect yourself from all these things. The conversation of cybersecurity is great, and it's imperative that everybody has that conversation. But you really need to take that one step further and ask yourself, how cyber resilient is my company? Because FBI Director Wray was on the floor of Congress within the last month talking about the attack that occurred on the government. And the question was asked, well, how is this possible? How are we not secure? And he was very open. There's no way you're going to be 100% secure. You're going to do everything that you can to block all of these things from getting in. But if they do get through, the question then becomes, how quickly can you detect that this attack occurred? Because that's imperative. But then also, how resilient is your business? How quickly can you remediate that issue and get everything back up online so you can get back into a production environment? Because that's the leverage that these criminals have. And so, yes, this is something that has been really crucial in keeping the economy running. But when we talk about what Microsoft's responsibility is, there's nothing that they can do about human error. And the folks will still open the door and let those criminals in. So it is critical as you take that inventory, and that needs to be part of a larger kind of disaster recovery plan, understanding not only where all that data lives, but also taking it a step further and saying, does everybody have access to the data that they need? That could be on the side of maybe somebody doesn't want to be the squeaky wheel and say, hey, I don't have access to everything I need to. That's where that inventory comes in. But more importantly, do folks only have the data that they need to do their particular job? I see, and I'm sure Ray can confirm, a lot of folks will go about integrating a SaaS application. They give everybody admin rights because it's easier. I don't know who needs admin rights. Let's just give it to everybody. Well, that causes a problem because now if one of those individuals gets attacked, well, now that can now migrate to that entire application. I'll give you a little homework assignment. There's a gentleman by the name of Kevin Mitnick. At one point, he was the most notorious hacker in the world. He was on the FBI's most wanted list back in the 90s. And when he was arrested, it was a very high-profile arrest. And he went to jail. He came out of jail and now started working with the good guys. He's what's called an ethical hacker. And back in June of 2019, we hired him to come out and do a presentation at our annual DattoCon conference. So conference of about 3,000 managed service providers around the globe. And he showed a live variant. This wasn't a theoretical, hey, this is what the criminals might be able to do. This wasn't some sort of click through. This was a live variant that he created that he said if he was still on the bad side, he would be deploying this right away. And he coined the term ransom cloud. And what this looked like, it was pretty simple. He stood on stage with these two laptops and he showed what an email would look like. It comes in, it looks legit. When you hear the phrase spear phishing attacks, or even one step further, socially engineered spear phishing attacks, their goal is to make that email look like every other email in that inbox. And now if you're sitting on a webinar like this saying, hey, I need to protect my data, and you get something like this looks pretty legitimate. Now I could make that title line within the email sender say whatever it wants. I could make that say Michael DePalma if I want, but if you do a simple thing is just hovering over that email address, you will see the domain that actual email address is going to. So I'm sure this would not have gone back to a Microsoft.com. It would have gone to something else, but a lot of people don't do that. Same thing with that hyperlink embedded in that following link. All you have to do is hover over that and take a look at that domain. If it's got 40 different consonants after it, chances are it's going to a malicious site, but a lot of people don't do that. And if you were to click on that link to say, I got to update my Anti-Spam Pro, it brings you to this screen. Again, looks like a legitimate update to your anti-spam. You click on that accept button, and once you do that, every single email has now been encrypted. And back to that point about whether you have admin rights, if you have admin rights, there's a risk of that entire domain now being encrypted. And this took all of a minute for him to show this on screen. And the only email you're able to open, anybody that's been hit with a ransomware attack has probably seen this email or something similar, this scary red screen that says, hey, you want to unencrypt your emails? Pay me some money in Bitcoin and I'll go ahead and do that for you. Very simple. And think about this is coming on 2 years since he gave this demo. Think about how that has evolved over the last 2 years. As data has spread to those different SaaS applications, think about where these criminals have been able to do, been able to go with the advancements to these types of things. These are live variants. These are out there right now, and they're going to find that data. Within that report, a quarter of those managed service providers reported attacks on those SaaS applications. The majority of those came within Microsoft 365. We did see an uptick in Dropbox, as well as G Suite, and that's actually what we use internally here. So yes, we're seeing it in real time, not something that is being predicted to happen down the road. It is happening right now. And when you look at what Microsoft in particular is responsible for, again, they've got a very, very hardened, robust cloud. They are going to guarantee that to some extent. Hardware failure, software failure, a natural disaster that occurs within their data centers, outages that might occur. That's part of their responsibility. But the tenant, who's ultimately you as the user, well, you're responsible for human error. 91% of downtime and data loss occurs because of human error, not typically a malicious actor, but somebody not knowing what they're supposed to or not supposed to click on. Malicious insiders that I mentioned, those are the folks that are disgruntled. Those external hackers, the viruses, the things like Ransom Cloud, that's your responsibility. And you could read that right in their SLAs. They will tell you that. And I've done presentations up at the Microsoft headquarters up in Burlington, and I've sat on panels. Well, they will talk about what they call the shared responsibility model. That yes, they will protect all of those things that I just showed on this last slide on the left-hand side, but they are not liable to data loss due to any sort of error on your end. They will not require, but recommend the use of those third-party apps, and that comes right from their SLA, right from their forums. You have discussions with them; they will encourage that. They do not have that liability for that deletion, and this is one of the misconceptions within this adoption of Microsoft 365. That the reason I'm moving to the cloud is because the cloud is so secure, and yes, that Microsoft's cloud is very secure, but there's data that you need to make sure that you're protecting. And you look at those thresholds. I think this is an interesting slide. You look at the thresholds of when this data is moved to the archive or once it's in a deleted recycling bin, when it's permanently deleted. And this is what basically lays out every different type of way data is stored and data is deleted. One of the things that you don't really think about is employee turnover. Before I came to Datto, I worked in the construction management industry, and we did large schools and hospitals and a lot of public work that you can be audited up to 7 years after that. Now think about the employee turnover. If there's critical data that's being stored on some employee's email that needs to be stored somewhere, and that employee leaves, do you continue to pay for that license, or can you say that data is backed up and I can move that folder into whoever took over his role? Once that turnover occurs and that account is turned off, that data will be deleted within a month after that occurs. And so these are critical kind of milestones for you to understand that that data is not going to just live out there forever and ever. Should it be deleted or should somebody leave your company? There is real reasons for that. G Suite, basically the same thing. The Google Workplace limitations. They're going to have the same type of language within their SLA, and really the same type of shared responsibility model that Microsoft 365 has. Same sort of data retention policies in place. And so it's very critical that you understand these thresholds, because without that, you really don't understand where data needs to be backed up, who has responsibility for that. And that's one of the reasons why, working with somebody like Ray to go through those types of things, to understand the inventory of where that data lives is extremely critical. Because you know what, data is going to live in different places in 5 years as well. And that needs that disaster recovery plan shouldn't be something that you develop one time and then you file it away somewhere and new employees come look at it. It needs to be a living and breathing document. And you need to take a step back and say, okay, a year later into this pandemic, where does data live? How many applications are we using right now? Who has access to them? Who has admin access to them? And if it's critical business data, is it being backed up? And so, hopefully this kind of opens your eyes to some of the reasons why this data needs to be protected and backed up as well. And it kind of goes into that more holistic cyber resiliency idea that goes beyond just the cybersecurity side. So with that, we've got a few minutes left. I know we're going to try to keep this short to about 30 minutes. So we do have some time left. I want to bring Ray back on to add any kind of parting thoughts. And if you have any questions, everybody's muted, but just put a question in the chat. But Ray, what are you seeing out there? And do you have any additional points to add?
Mostly what we see is when we're speaking to our customers, they are completely unaware of the responsibility. And honestly, so are we. I mean, I didn't back that data up until I learned that you guys had the solution, and I looked into it and said, oh my gosh, I'm like, we could be in some, real deep stuff if we don't start doing this. And honestly, we deployed your solution within, I think, a day. And we're up and running. And while email is a big part of it, the other part that we really kind of were thinking about was the OneDrive and the SharePoint sites, because I don't think people realize that stuff's not backed up.
Exactly. And to that end, I mean, I think you're ahead of the curve right now by putting on these educational webinars, because within that managed services community that I have a lot of conversations with, obviously at different industry shows, I think the vast majority of them are not thinking that their clients really need to back up this data, or aren't educated enough to have that conversation as to the why. And so I think once the business community starts to see this, it really becomes something that needs to be included in any of these deployments. And it's not something that takes up a lot of resources, as you could speak to. It's not something that's going to be a huge amount of money. And when you look back, if something were to occur, you're really going to kick yourself if you hadn't put data protection and backups in place for that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I had a customer who, we had been sort of reaching out to about, business continuity, and, it wasn't important to them. They're a municipality, they're bound by budgets and so forth, and they got hacked. And I know it's not the Office 365 stuff, but, it wasn't important to them until it became important to them.
Yeah. And I'm sure it's the same conversations you probably had 10 years ago when we were talking about server backups, right? And I think that has now evolved into this conversation, in that, it used to be, I've got tape backup. Now tape backup is pretty obscure, right? And now folks are understanding business continuity and image-based and all those type of things, and geo-redundancy. That's where this conversation is right now. And we're having more and more of these style webinars. And again, you go look at any sort of third-party reporting, and they will show very similar statistics. And the criminals are seeing this, and they know that a lot of people are in the same boat that you might have been a couple years ago before you started looking into this stuff, and they love it. They're licking their chops. And within that within that ransom report, only 3 in 10 business owners were highly concerned about these cyber threats. The criminals know they don't have to change anything if they don't want to. It's already a multi-billion-dollar a year industry, and it's working, and the business community is not opening their eyes to it. So they've got a foolproof business model,
And Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't I see something recently that the government had made it illegal to pay the ransom? Is that accurate?
Yeah, the Treasury Department put out a statement in October, and they've always kind of recommended it. Anecdotally, that you're not supposed to pay, but they finally put out an official statement saying that by paying the ransom, you are at risk of violating the law. And the reason behind that is a lot of times, unfortunately, the attackers are terrorist organizations or enemy nation states. So by paying the ransom, you could be inadvertently funding one of these terrorist organizations. Now, it's next to impossible at this point to track exactly where that money is going because they're almost always asking for it in Bitcoin, but it is showing the direction for sure that the government is taking. Their stance is it's your responsibility to protect your data, and paying the ransom is not an option because that's the only way we're going to stop these guys. So yeah, that was their first official statement, and we'll see where that goes. But the way that the regulations work, once they decide on something, the adoption of these policies is very quick. Once they make a regulation, it's normally, hey, you got to show me within the next 90 days that you're protected. And they don't give a lot of lead time for these businesses to adhere to these new regulations.
Well, that's interesting. I'm surprised by the stance, but when you put it into the terms of terrorist organizations, et cetera, it certainly makes sense.
Yeah, it's scary stuff. And again, that's another kind of layer, and you can have a whole conversation about who's behind these attacks. But one of the false sense of security is, hey, there's two different sentiments. There's one is, hey, it's got some kid in his basement doing these attacks, so we can brag about it on the web. Or there's other businesses that see the government get attacked and say they throw their hands up and say, well, what am I going to do? If they can get through on the government, what am I going to do? And so, I think there's ways that you have to do everything within your power to protect the data from getting attacked in the first place, but then ultimately to make sure you can recover that data. And it'll be a constant, a constant race against the criminals, that's for sure.
Right. Well, Michael, I really appreciate it. I don't see any questions at this point in time. I mean, we'll open the floor, give it a minute for questions. Feel free to submit your questions via chat, and we'll answer them to our best of our ability, but we will also be recording the webinars, or we are recording the webinar. So
yeah, so if you want to share this with anybody else within your organization, feel free. We kept it to 30 minutes, so it's not a huge ask to watch a 30-minute webinar, but I'll go back and I'll close with that. The idea behind cyber resiliency, it starts with people. It's people, processes, and then technology. And there's a lot of great technologies out there, but education is the most critical piece of this, because that's how these criminals are getting in. So I appreciate everyone taking some time out this morning to listen into this, and hopefully you get some takeaways. But more importantly, share those takeaways with other folks within your organization, and do some due diligence on some of the vendors that you're working with as well. Make sure that they are putting the protections in place. I think that's critical, and that's the only way as a community, as a business community, we combat these things.
Right. Michael, I appreciate your knowledge and your presentation, and I hope that my customers have found this educational and eye-opening. And we will, follow up with those. I see somebody just joined. The presentation's essentially over, but we will send this out via recording so that you'll have the opportunity to, hear the presentation that we just gave, et cetera.
All right. Well, I appreciate you having me, Ray, and good luck, everybody, and stay safe. And warm weather is coming, so we're in the right track. So appreciate your time.
Take care, Michael.
All right. Thanks, Ray. Bye.
Bye.